My neighbor Irene called me at 10 at night and said she thought she saw my son's truck parked in the Kroger lot on Morse Road. She said she'd driven past twice. The second time, she saw a little face pop up in the back window. I didn't sleep after that call. I just lay there staring at the ceiling until it was light enough to leave. My name is Gerald Hayward. I'm 64 years old. I spent 31 years running a construction and contracting business in central Ohio. Built it from a pickup truck and a tool belt into a company with 62 employees. Sold it 3 years ago for enough that I stopped worrying about money. I'm not a wealthy man by any standard that would impress Carl Fain. But I have resources, I have patience, and I have never once in my life walked away from anything that mattered. I pulled into that Kroger lot at 7 in the morning. The sun was barely up and the lot was mostly empty. I almost missed the truck. It was backed into a corner spot between a recycling bin and a concrete divider, half hidden under a broken light post. Lyle's old gray F-150, the one I helped him buy 11 years ago when he landed his first real engineering job. There was a blanket taped over the back passenger window from the inside. I parked 3 spots away and sat there for a moment. Then I got out and walked over and knocked on the driver's window. Nothing for a few seconds. Then the blanket on the back window shifted and a small face appeared. My granddaughter Cora, 7 years old, with her mother's dark hair and her father's eyes, blinking at me like she wasn't sure I was real. Then another face right beside her. May, same eyes, same confused look. The driver's door opened and my son climbed out. I hadn't seen Lyle in 6 weeks. He'd lost at least 20 pounds. The circles under his eyes were so dark they looked bruised. He was wearing the Carhartt jacket I'd given him for Christmas 3 years ago and it hung off him like it belonged to a bigger man. He looked at me and said, "Dad, that was it. Just Dad." Then he put his face in his hands. I put my hand on the back of his neck the same way I did when he was 9 years old and broke his collarbone falling out of the oak tree in our backyard. "How long?" I said. He wiped his face on his sleeve. 19 days. I got the girls out of the back seat. They were still in their pajamas. Cora had 1 sock on. They pressed themselves against my legs, and I held onto them and looked at my son over their heads, and I thought very clearly. Whoever did this to my family made a serious mistake. I took them to the IHOP on Carl Road and ordered half the kids' menu. Cora and May ate like they hadn't had a real meal in days because it turned out they hadn't. Lyle drank 3 cups of coffee and stared at the table, and I let him sit with it for a few minutes because I could see he was working up to something. Then he told me everything. He and Loretta had been married 9 years. I'll be honest with you, I never warmed to that woman the way a man is supposed to warm to his son's wife. She came from a family that moved through the world with the confidence of people who had never been seriously inconvenienced. Her father, Carl Fain, had spent 30 years building a real estate business in the northern suburbs, and he treated that business like a dynasty. He was the kind of man who remembered every favor he'd ever done for anyone and kept a running tally in his head. Her brother Ned was a mortgage broker who dressed like he was auditioning for a TV show about mortgage brokers. When Lyle married Loretta, I gave them my blessing because my son loved her and I trusted his judgment. He was a structural engineer, smart, steady, not the kind of man who made reckless decisions. They bought a 4-bedroom house in Westerville. They had the twins. He got promoted to project lead. From the outside, it looked exactly like what it was supposed to look like. What I didn't know was that Loretta had been quietly unhappy for most of their marriage. And instead of talking to Lyle about it, she'd been talking to her father. Carl Fain had decided somewhere along the way that his daughter had married beneath herself. Lyle was a good engineer, but he wasn't in the right rooms. He couldn't do anything for the family in the way Carl understood that word. What Lyle only found out too late was that Loretta had been seeing someone else. His name was Perry Langston, a commercial real estate developer, which made him exactly the kind of man Carl had always wanted for his daughter. The affair had been going on for at least 14 months before Loretta made her move, and when she moved like someone who had been planning it for a long time. Because she had. It started 8 months before I found Lyle in that parking lot. Loretta began telling people, carefully and selectively, that she was worried about him, that he had a problem, that he'd been gambling. She said it to her mother, to her friends, to colleagues at the school where she worked as an administrator. She built a story brick by brick that Lyle Hayward was a man who had been secretly losing money for years, who had drained savings accounts to cover his debts, who became volatile when confronted. None of it was true, not a single word. Carl Fain had a connection in the family court system, an attorney who owed him favors. That attorney helped Loretta file an emergency protective order on a Thursday afternoon in September, citing fear of physical harm. Lyle came home from work that evening and found a sheriff's deputy in his driveway and a piece of paper telling him he had 2 hours to take what he could carry and leave his own house. The house he had saved 6 years to put a down payment on, he was not allowed to return. He was not allowed to contact Loretta except through attorneys. A temporary custody order was filed the same week. Loretta got primary custody of Cora and May. Lyle was given supervised visitation, 2 sessions per week, 2 hours each, at a family services center on Saunders Road. He went every single time. He was never late. He brought art supplies because Cora had gotten into drawing horses that year and May was obsessed with making bracelets. He sat in that supervised room and colored horses and strung beads and did not once say anything to his daughters about their mother or what was happening. Loretta brought the girls for 4 weeks. Then she started canceling stomach bug, school conflict. Cora had a cold. Lyle would drive to that center and wait in the parking lot for 20 minutes before a coordinator came out to tell him the visit was off. It happened 6 times in 8 weeks. He called his attorney each time. His attorney filed motions. The family court moved at the speed of erosion. Meanwhile, Lyle had been staying in a friend's spare room, then a motel on Bethel Road when the friend's wife ran out of patience. Then the motel money ran out. The joint accounts had been frozen pending divorce proceedings. The account Loretta claimed Lyle had drained was one he had never seen before. She had opened it 18 months earlier and made 23 transfers into it over 15 months, totaling $61,000. His attorney found it in discovery, but proving it was fraud rather than routine financial planning was slow and expensive, and Lyle was running out of money to pay for slow and expensive. Then Phyllis called him, Phyllis Fain. Loretta's mother. I want to say something about Phyllis because she is the most complicated figure in this whole story. She was not a cruel woman. She had always been polite to me, genuinely warm to Lyle in the early years, and I believe she loved Cora and May the way grandmothers love grandchildren, which is to say completely and without condition. But she was a woman who had spent 40 years deferring to Carl Fain. And that kind of long practice makes cowardice feel like loyalty. She called Lyle at 10:30 on a Friday night. She was crying. She said Loretta had left that afternoon with Perry Langston and wouldn't be back until Sunday. She said she had the girls, but her back had gone out and she could barely get off the couch and she was scared. She said, "Please, Lyle, I can't do this tonight. Please just come and get them." He drove to the Fain house in Dublin in 22 minutes. Phyllis met him at the door with a bag of the girls' clothes and their stuffed animals. Cora was asleep on her feet. May was crying quietly because she didn't understand what was happening. Phyllis said, "I'm sorry, Lyle. I'm so sorry." He believed she meant it. He took the girls. He knew it was legally complicated. His attorney had explained the order clearly. Primary custody with Loretta. Lyle's access limited to the supervised sessions. Taking the girls without Loretta's explicit consent was a violation of the temporary custody order, even if Phyllis had asked him to. He knew this. He thought about it the entire drive back. But he also thought about Cora asleep on her feet and May crying and a 63-year-old woman alone with a bad back being used as a babysitter so her daughter could spend the weekend with a man she'd been seeing behind Lyle's back for over a year. He took them to the motel. He checked out the next morning and put what was left on his credit card, which was close to its limit. He thought about calling me. He said he thought about it every single day for 19 days, and every time he talked himself out of it because he was ashamed. That broke my heart. Because he had nothing in the world to be ashamed of. He drove to the Kroger lot on Morse Road because it was well lit and open 24 hours and had a bathroom inside. He bought food from the hot deli counter, put the girls to bed in the back seat with every blanket he owned, slept in the front seat, 19 days. I listened to all of it without interrupting. When he finished, I sat quietly for a moment watching Cora carefully cut her pancake into exactly equal halves, the way she had done since she was 3 years old. That small, ordinary habit made my throat tighten in a way I hadn't expected. Then I said, "Do you still have Phyllis's number in your phone?" He looked at me. "Yeah, call her. Tell her the girls are safe and they're with me. Do it now before she calls Loretta." He stared at me. "Dad, I violated the custody order." I said, "Loretta left her children with an elderly woman who could barely stand so she could go away for the weekend with her boyfriend. That is also a fact. And facts have a way of mattering." I stood up. "Call Phyllis," he called. She picked up on the second ring and started crying almost immediately. She said she hadn't told Loretta. She said she'd been terrified. Lyle asked her directly, "Did you ask me to come get them?" There was a pause. She said yes. He said, "I need you to remember that you asked me." She said, "I know what I did. I know I took everyone to my house, made up the guest room for the girls. They slept 11 hours straight. Lyle slept on my couch. I sat in the kitchen with a cup of coffee and thought about what came next. The next morning I called Beverly Stanton. She was a family law attorney I had worked with 2 years earlier during a contract dispute. Sharp, methodical, never raised her voice in a room. I had watched her dismantle a man twice her size in a deposition without ever changing her expression. I explained the situation to her assistant, and Beverly called me back within the hour. 2 days later, Lyle and I sat in her office on Polaris Parkway. She listened to everything without taking notes, which I had learned was her habit. When Lyle finished, she leaned forward and asked him a series of questions that were so precise they felt almost surgical. The accounts, the transfers, the timeline of the protective order, the pattern of canceled visits, the phone call from Phyllis. When he was done, she leaned back and said, "The custody violation is a problem, but it is a manageable problem given the circumstances, especially if Phyllis Fain is willing to sign a declaration confirming she called Lyle and asked him to take the children. What I am more interested in is the protective order itself. Everything downstream of that order flows from the initial claims Loretta made to obtain it, the custody arrangement, the account freeze, the narrative about gambling. If she built a false story to get that order, that matters." She paused. "That could constitute fraud on the court, and that changes this from a contested divorce into something considerably more serious for everyone who helped construct that story." I looked at Lyle. He was sitting up straighter than he had in weeks. Beverly brought in a private investigator named Roy Sutter. Former Columbus police detective, 58 years old, same blue windbreaker every time I saw him, moved through the world with the total absence of urgency that I recognized as the mark of someone who was very good at what he did. He found Perry Langston in 4 days, documented the relationship going back 16 months through cell records, hotel receipts, and the social media activity of Langston's personal assistant, who had a habit of posting background details in her Instagram stories without realizing what she was including. Roy established that the affair had been active and ongoing during the entire period when Loretta was telling people Lyle was unstable. The financial investigation took longer and turned up more. The $61,000 was only the beginning. Beverly's forensic accountant found that Loretta had also taken out a home equity line of credit against the Westerville house using documents that carried Lyle's signature. Lyle had never signed those documents. He had never applied for that line. He had never known it existed. The line had been opened 9 months before the divorce filing, well before any formal legal proceedings. That meant it was not a marital asset dispute. It was fraud. The accountant also found that 6 months before Loretta filed the protective order, large transfers had been made from Lyle's personal account to an LLC registered in Ned Fain's name. These were the transfers Loretta had pointed to as proof of gambling losses. The transfers were real. Lyle had not made them. Someone with access to his banking credentials, his login, his security questions, had made them from inside his own household. Roy ran the device logs. The logins to Lyle's bank account had been made from a specific device. That device was registered to an email address. Roy put the file on the table in front of me one afternoon in my kitchen and looked at me without saying anything. The email address belonged to my daughter, Sandra Hayward, 41 years old. My daughter. I sat with that for a long moment. Roy didn't rush me. He was the kind of man who understood there are things you need a minute with before you can move forward. I want to tell you about Sandra, because the twist here only means something if you understand what I thought I knew about her. She used to bring Cora and May books every time she came over for the holidays. She knew which ones they liked. She remembered things like that. 2 Thanksgivings ago, she sat at my kitchen table for 3 hours helping May make a paper turkey out of her handprints, patient as anything, laughing when the glue wouldn't hold. I had no reason to think that woman was capable of what Roy laid out in front of me. Sandra had gone through a divorce 4 years earlier. Carl Fain had connected her with a family court attorney, the same network he would later use for Loretta. She walked away from that divorce with the house and a settlement that made more sense once you understood Carl had helped engineer it. In exchange, she had gone to work for Carl's company, a real estate license, a salary, and a stake in one of his investment LLCs. She had access to Lyle's banking credentials from years of living in the same house, the way family members do when they trust each other completely. She used them. She funneled money from Lyle's account into Ned's LLC to build the gambling narrative. She provided Carl with the information he needed to take her own brother apart from the inside. And then she sat in a courtroom and testified that she had personally witnessed Lyle behaving erratically. Her brother, her own brother. Beverly called me the evening after Roy delivered the report. She said, "Gerald, this was not a marriage that fell apart. This was a coordinated plan. And your daughter was the piece on the inside. I already knew that." Hearing it said out loud was a different thing entirely. There is a particular kind of grief that comes from realizing someone you raised, someone you watched grow up, made a choice like this. It doesn't hit you all at once. It settles in slowly, the way cold does when you've been standing outside too long and you don't notice it until you can't feel your hands. I sat in my kitchen that night and I thought about May's paper turkey. Then I picked up the phone and called Beverly back and told her we were ready to move. Beverly filed an emergency motion to modify the custody arrangement based on newly discovered evidence of fraud and financial misconduct. She filed a separate motion for Lyle to have unsupervised temporary residential custody pending the full hearing, supported by a declaration from Phyllis Fain confirming that she had called Lyle, asked him to take the children, and that Loretta had left the girls in her care for an extended period without consent. Phyllis had agreed to provide that declaration. She came to my house one evening to give it. She sat at my kitchen table, the same table where Sandra had helped May with that paper turkey 2 Thanksgivings ago, and she signed the paper with her hands shaking. When she finished, she looked at Lyle and said, "I should have said something sooner." He told her it was all right. I was not sure it was all right. But I understood why he said it. I want to say something else about Phyllis because I think it matters. A few days before she came to sign the declaration, she called me. She said she needed to tell me something she had not included in her original account. She said that about 3 weeks before Lyle ended up in that parking lot, she had been sitting in the hallway of Carl's office waiting for him to finish a phone call. The door was not fully closed. She heard 2 voices, Carl's and Sandra's. She said she did not hear everything, but she heard enough to understand that they were discussing Lyle's bank account and what had already been moved. She said she had told herself she misunderstood. She said she had been telling herself that for 3 weeks she agreed to include that in a supplemental statement for Beverly. That was the second wall coming down. The morning of the emergency custody hearing, I drove Lyle to the courthouse and sat behind him in the gallery. Loretta was there with her attorney, a man named Cliff Merritt, who looked like he spent considerably more time on golf courses than in courtrooms. Carl Fain sat in the back row in a suit that cost more than most people's monthly rent. He looked at me when I walked in, the kind of steady measuring look men like him use to signal they are not worried. I looked back at him for a moment. Then I looked away. I had nothing to prove to Carl Fain, and I knew it. Sandra was not in the room for the emergency hearing that came later. Beverly stood up and spoke for 22 minutes. She was not dramatic about it. She was methodical and specific, and she placed documents in front of the judge one at a time, like laying cards on a table. The forged signature on the home equity application, the 23 transfers to Ned Fain's LLC, the device logs connecting those transfers to Sandra's registered email address, the documented pattern of Loretta canceling Lyle's visitation sessions, the timeline of the affair with Perry Langston, Phyllis's declaration, Phyllis's supplemental statement about the conversation she overheard. Cliff Merritt objected several times. The judge overruled him each time with a brevity that made clear she was not impressed. At the end of the hearing, the judge granted Lyle temporary residential custody of Cora and May. Pending a full evidentiary hearing scheduled 6 weeks out, she issued a preservation order on all financial records associated with both parties, and she referred the forged signature documents to the county prosecutor's office. I watched Carl Fain's face when the judge said that last part. Something moved across it that had not been there before. I rented a 3-bedroom house in Worthington 2 days later, furnished. It had a yard with a big maple tree out back. Cora said it looked like a good climbing tree. I tested it myself before I let her near it. She was right. I enrolled the girls in the elementary school 4 blocks away using the notarized temporary custody order. Their first morning, Cora brought her horse drawings to show her new teacher. May wore every bracelet she owned on her left arm, which came to 14. I drove them there and watched them walk through the front door, and I thought about the last 7 weeks and what it had taken to get to that ordinary moment. The full evidentiary hearing took place 6 weeks later and ran 2 full days. Beverly put 47 exhibits and 3 expert witnesses in front of the judge. The forensic accountant walked through every transfer, every account, every timestamp. The digital forensic specialist explained how device logs work and what they show and what they definitively prove about who accessed Lyle's banking credentials, and when the handwriting expert testified that the signature on the home equity application was inconsistent with Lyle's known signature samples in 11 measurable and specific ways. Cliff Merritt cross-examined each witness. None of those cross-examinations went well for his client. What came out over those 2 days was the full shape of it. The plan had been Carl's design from the beginning. He had introduced Loretta to Cliff Merritt not as a divorce attorney, but as an advisor, 9 months before the protective order was filed. Ned Fain had set up the LLC specifically to receive the transfers from Lyle's account. The home equity application had been prepared by a notary who was a longtime business associate of Carl's, a man who by the time of the hearing was already being separately investigated by the county prosecutor, and Sandra had been the piece on the inside. She had provided the banking credentials, she had made the transfers, she had given Carl the information he needed. She had testified in the preliminary proceedings that she personally witnessed Lyle behaving in ways that supported Loretta's narrative. When Beverly put the device logs in front of the judge and walked through what they showed, Sandra was sitting in the gallery 3 rows behind Loretta. I was sitting 4 rows behind Sandra. I did not look at her during that part of the proceedings. I did not trust what my face might do. The judge's ruling came 3 weeks after the hearing ended. Loretta was denied primary custody. Lyle was granted primary residential custody of Cora and May. Loretta was given supervised visitation 2 sessions per week, 2 hours each, at the Family Services Center on Saunders Road. The same center where Lyle had sat in the parking lot 6 times waiting for visits that never happened. I don't know whether the judge chose that location deliberately. I choose to believe she did. The civil judgment ordered Loretta to repay $61,000 in transferred funds, plus the outstanding balance on the fraudulently obtained home equity line, which with interest had reached nearly $40,000. The judgment also awarded Lyle attorney fees that made Cliff Merritt visibly wince when the judge read the number aloud. Ned Fain entered a plea agreement on charges related to receiving fraudulently transferred funds and was required to repay the full amount plus penalties. Carl Fain was under active criminal investigation for his role in designing and facilitating the scheme. The notary associate who prepared the forged home equity documents pleaded guilty to document fraud and lost his license. Sandra was referred for separate criminal charges related to the unauthorized account access and the transfers. She lost her stake in Carl's LLC as part of the civil judgment. The last time I spoke to Beverly about it, the process was still moving forward. The law moves slowly. I have made peace with that. The legal system does not exist to balance the scales to my exact satisfaction, and I stopped expecting it to. What it did was give my son his daughters back and put the truth in front of a judge who could see it clearly. That is enough. What I have now is this. I have a house in Worthington with a maple tree in the backyard. I eat dinner there 3 nights a week. Lyle built Cora and May a small raised garden bed along the back fence. Cora is growing sunflowers. May is growing strawberries. Neither of them is growing what they planted, but that is the nature of gardens and of children, and I stopped trying to explain it to them because they don't seem to mind. Lyle went back to full-time work about 2 months after the ruling. He looks like himself again, better than himself actually. Like a man who walked through something that should have broken him and came out the other side with a cleaner understanding of what is real and what matters. Cora asked me once, about 4 months after everything settled, whether I had been scared when I found them in the parking lot that February morning. I thought about it honestly for a moment. I said no, I was just mad. She considered this with the seriousness that 7-year-olds bring to everything. Mad at Loretta, she asked. Mad at the situation, I said, which was as close to honest as I could be with a 7-year-old without saying things she doesn't need to carry. She nodded like that made sense to her. Then she asked if I wanted to see how tall her sunflowers were. I did. I always do. There is one more thing I need to say, and I have been thinking about how to say it since I started writing this down. I have 2 children. I raised them in the same house with the same values, the same expectations, the same love as far as I knew how to give it. One of them, when it came down to it, chose money and a business arrangement over her own brother, over her nieces, over everything I thought we stood for as a family. I'm not going to pretend I have made peace with that. I have not. What I have done is accept that it is true and that I cannot change it, and that sitting in grief over it does not help Lyle or Cora or May, who are the people still in front of me. I found my son in a parking lot in February. I brought him home. We fixed it together. That part of the story ended the way it needed to end. The other part I'm still learning to live with. If you're reading this and you know a man who is sitting somewhere in silence right now because he is too ashamed to ask for help, I want you to tell him something. The shame he is feeling is not about him. It is about what was done to him. There is a difference, and it matters. My son sat in a parking lot for 19 days because he believed he had failed. He had not failed. He had been deliberately taken apart by people who spent months preparing to do exactly that. And he still showed up to every supervised visit with art supplies and sat in that room and made bracelets with his daughters without saying a word against the people who were dismantling his life on the outside. That is not failure. That is the opposite of failure. The people who love you cannot help you if you do not let them know you need it. That is not weakness. That is the whole point of having people pick up the phone.